I've got Ben is a senior and Ethan is a sophomore. And I just wanted to say thank you guys all for coming tonight. Jared Cox works at Southern Oregon Pediatrics and was recommended that I go talk to him when I had this idea about bringing a little education class in by Matt and Mary Huff, who I adore. I'm sure some of you do too. They recommended Jared, and Eileen and I went and talked to him, and I were just really impressed with what he had to say and how we can help our kids with the stress that they're going through right now. So, thanks.
Sky on silent. You guys don't mind doing the same if that's okay. So I'm really pleased to be here just to speak with you all. So some familiar faces, like you, some not so familiar, but I'm really happy to just to speak with you tonight, have a conversation. I put a PowerPoint together. My hope is to buzz through that thing in about 20 minutes or so, and then I really want to leave time to just hear your questions, your concerns, your thoughts, and just to really have a dialogue about this, very large issue of education and the impact that education has on the young minds in our country and in our county, and specifically here at this school, and really how stress can help or hinder that whole process, and what as a community, as a family, as a school, we can do to really try to support the behavioral, mental, physical health of our students. So go through this thing. So just a really brief info on stress. I'm sure you all have heard that term and have a good idea of what it means, but I just wanted to point out this idea that stress is this discrete physiological response and emotional response to some sort of perceived threat in the environment, and the idea is that this energy that comes from the stress response comes to help address whatever the threat in the environment is, and then once that threat has gone away, whether that's a test or whether that's a car careening around the corner at you, whatever it is, that once that stressor has gone away, that the stress response damps down and the body returns to a relative state of calm, and so that's the idea, is that with the stress response, on the one hand, if we don't have enough stress in our lives, then we might not be as motivated to face challenges or accomplish things. So the idea that stress isn't inherently good or bad, it's just that depending on how much stress you're under or experiencing, it can really have an impact on your performance, either underperforming with too little stress or stress that's too high. And so the idea is that there's some sort of sweet spot in terms of the amount of stress that really activates one to feel challenged and to learn and grow, but not be so overwhelmed that learning is inhibited. So when stress becomes chronic, that's when you start to see a lot of problems cropping up. You start to see a lot of warning signs. And so I just wanted to point out a couple of what the research would suggest are the correlations between chronic stress and mental health and physical health. So I'll just put those up there. Sorry if the font is too small. I didn't know how it would look on the big screen. So basically, chronic stress, not so good. There's a thought that it has a direct impact on just our physical being, but also can certainly dramatically impact our health behaviors in terms of eating patterns, sleeping patterns, use of substances, that sort of thing. And so the idea here is just that chronic stress is potentially a very damaging force, and it can be the most damaging when certain conditions are present. And so those conditions look like having to face a stressor against your will. So it wasn't a choice to engage whatever this difficult situation is. It's just thrust upon you and you have no choice. So that's one part. And feeling like whatever it is that's stressing you out, whatever that situation or circumstance is, it is really beyond your control, and you see no option to be able to impact it at all. Oftentimes when I'm working with young adults, when the homework mounts up to a certain degree, this feeling starts to show up, and so that sense of just complete overwhelm, and there's really nothing that can be done to climb out of that hole. And so also, when stress levels are high enough, oftentimes, if someone's facing something and it's a a really meaningful goal that someone's pursuing and you have to endure a lot of stress, oftentimes, people can find their way through those difficult, challenging times because there's some meaning in it. There's some sort of purpose in that whole ordeal. When no purpose is seen and there's no meaning that really presents itself, then I think that's when things become even more stressful, coping responses become even more challenged. So now here's some interesting more recent research is this idea that the way we view stress can really either mitigate the impact of stress or make it worse. And so there was a pretty interesting study that looked at just how many stressful life events someone experienced and the link between that and if they had an early demise. And so what they found is that there was a link that a 43% increase in mortality, but only if the person experiencing the stressful life event had a belief that stress is harmful to their health. So they would kind of catalog people's stressful life events and also catalog their views towards stress, whether it was something that was harmful, neutral, or potentially positive. So this really stood out to me in that I think as we help educate ourselves and our families and students about the impacts and the role of stress, there can really be this association that stress is all bad. We need to avoid stress. But the downside of that is that having a goal to avoid stress might be linked with some pretty negative health outcomes. And so I think the mindset might need to be shifted to the fact that you really can't avoid stress, and trying to avoid stress is stressful, right? And so it kind of leaves us with what to do in that situation, and I'll come back to that. So clearly students are at risk for chronic stress, and so there's some decent research that has been done fairly recently that teens are reporting that stress levels during the school year are in an unhealthy range, and that's a pretty subjective viewpoint. But when they ask adults, this is from the American Psychological Association, teens are reporting stress levels higher than adults, for the time period that it's happening. And so, sometimes there's this thought that in these years, these developmental years, there's, ideally some mix of, achievement, developing maturity and responsibility and individuation, able to take care of oneself, and also this idea that there's still, some fun to be had and some enjoyment to have in life. And so the teams are reporting that just school feels like a job, and it's really looked at as a job in a lot of respects, and the work is increasing. So Stanford did a study that suggested that over 2 hours of schoolwork a night would be associated with chronic stress in students. And so when they further researched this, it looked like the average in very high performing schools was 3.1 hours a night. So that's the average. So of course there's going to be some periods throughout the school year where it's going to be much higher than that. And so these are all just to set up some of the context here. So there's a greater percentage of students are taking AP classes, and of course testing, sometimes people taking those tests multiple times. And so I think that's all to say that you kind of run into the situation where you just have this cycle, that kids start to go through that and things really start to feel repetitive, mundane. That whole meaning piece, where's the meaning in this, might start to drain out of some of these activities when they become just this, students become habituated to a chronically high level of stress. So some of the backdrop, I bet some of you are more familiar with this than I am, but I just wanted to point out a few of these things. And so, really looking at this idea that there's just more competition, and so which drives more effort, upstream of students trying to get into college. And so in some ways, it seems to create this negative cycle where there's just more and more expectations upon students in terms of what they need to do to be a good candidate for getting into the college they want to get into. And so I think that on the one hand, it's great to shoot for your goals in terms of which college you want to go to, and at the same time, it seems like there's this process at play that is adding on to the stress that students are experiencing, especially around the college hunt. So that kind of leaves us with, what do we do? And so I wanted to walk through a few things there. So looking at our stress mindset, looking at health behaviors, and reviewing and revising administrative policies. You guys might want to have some words with me after. I really like this from a psychologist that does a lot of research at Stanford. And so I think this kind of characterizes that shift in mindset. And so there's some initial research that's suggesting that trying to shift one's mindset around stress can be a beneficial thing for your health. And so there's another psychologist named Aaliyah Crum, based out of Stanford as well, that has some really nice information, kind of a step-by-step way of like, how do you handle these really stressful situations in a way that might model for your students or for your family members, really how to try to tackle these difficult circumstances. And so just acknowledging that something's stressful, and that could be something that you verbalize simply just, wow, this is really hard, this is tough, I'm feeling a bit of stress here. Really, here's the shift. Oftentimes, when people have that kind of flood of stress hormones and really start feeling the effects of stress physiologically, that there can be a few moments there of kind of wondering, oh no, what's happening, or starting to view things and kind of shifting into a more negative outlook on the circumstance. And so the idea here is just simply trying to see those physiological changes that would suggest that something meaningful is happening. Something you care about has come into view. And so the next step is really, how do you channel that energy? And so really your body is ramping itself up to be able to deal with a challenge or a threat, and the idea is really trying to see things more as a challenge, and then be able to use that energy to, whether that's to study or to address a physical challenge, or whether it's to address an interpersonal challenge, really trying to use that energy and focus it, rather than spending time trying to not feel that or trying to somehow feel different. Actually using that, whatever those feelings are, whether it's anxiety or stress, or some mixture of frustration or anger, or whatever that particular emotional signal is. So, and the last one is really tapping into social support. So just being able to share out loud, what your experiences are around a particularly challenging episode or event. We all do this. I think it's something that it's really useful. I'm finding that a lot of the students that I work with certainly use social support in for the most part, in very healthy ways. So from another research out of, I believe this was New York University. So they interviewed all these students from several different high-performing schools in the New York City area, and they put together the responses and kind of put them into a couple of different themes. So they did some qualitative research on this, and they found that really, sports and exercise, just kind of good academic, organizational type of skills, and then having a balanced mindset around school performance versus just enjoyment of life, were the main coping skills that students said worked for them. And so same study suggested that about 25% of the students interviewed use substance use as a way to cope, and so that's certainly in the mix too. And ideally, we're tilting, students' coping strategies more toward these types of strategies versus less healthy ones. And so, how do we do that? I think this is kind of everyone in the community's job to model behaviors that you would like to see in those with whom you work. And so I think that eating, of course, this can be an incredibly huge challenge when you've got flaming Cheetos, so really trying to find a way to model just actually having sit-down meals, or just decent food is offered, but at the same time, you don't want to turn that into its own power struggle. And so I think that just simply modeling some sort of way of fueling oneself in a relatively healthy fashion can go a long way. Sleeping, somewhere between 8 and 10 hours per 24 would be nice. It's definitely not happening all that often. But I think that this really comes into how do you negotiate this? How is this something that you address? And it really comes down to just what are some of the rules there. And so I wanted to mention social jet lag. This idea that when we all probably experience this when you maybe sleep in much later on the weekends. You're used to getting up really early, maybe staying up late on the weeknights, and then kind of catch up on the weekends. This can certainly throw the body clock off a little bit and lead to kids complaining of more fatigue and feeling just not quite with it. Concentration's not quite as where they would like it. So just something to consider. And so some of the sleep recommendations on this would be having a relatively consistent wake up time, within an hour or so between weekdays and weekends. Kids are going to love that, by the way. So I think just having opportunities for just play, where there's no specific goal orientation other than just the enjoyment of the activity itself. And so I think making sure that these types of things are built into the day-to-day routine, and maybe in very small doses, but just as kind of a counterbalance to that incredible focus and goal orientation that is their academic situation. So I think scheduling. You see like all kinds of cartoons about how overscheduled we are, but it doesn't mean that it's any less important. I think that really looking at scheduling, and I think this depends on probably your temperament and then your children's temperament in terms of how much activity and how much rest between activities helps them stay somewhat regulated, helps them stay somewhat balanced, physically, emotionally, and so that's just something to consider, to take a look at. So I think being able to just kind of model and all of those different skills that make folks successful in the work that they do, whether that's at home or outside of the home. And so I think sometimes just saying the stuff out loud, because trying to tell your adolescent exactly how to do something, it's probably what result you're going to get there more often than not. So I think once again it comes to kind of modeling and being able to really demonstrate these sort of things for yourself, and once again just finding little ways to encourage these types of activities. Screen time, I think that this is probably one that ties in with the sleep, and so just being really careful about how electronics are managed in your household. So just being intentional. I think I'm not going to give you any specific recommendation on what's the proper amount of time. I think the American Academy of Pediatrics has a view on that in terms of somewhere around 2 hours or less per day. But I think that it really comes down to how does that fit into the overall plan of a kid accomplishing things, including getting a decent amount of sleep, including having some downtime. So I think that's just useful conversations to have. And you also want to consider how easy it is to get very habituated to a certain amount of screen time. So if you want to make any changes, expect that there might be some friction with that. So and I can shoot this PowerPoint out to whoever I need to be able to broadcast it to other folks if you want. But there's a couple of pretty cool smartphone apps for self-management that some people find helpful, specifically when there's an issue related to more like a specific topic like anxiety or panic or dealing with depression, or just trying to find some really positive ways to build resilience around which includes just lots of different kind of self-management, relaxation types of exercises. So, all right. So maintaining a balanced perspective, really taking a look at how you define success, not only verbally in terms of what you say you think success is, but also how you act, how you respond to different things in the media around this image of success. How often are you just really discussing this in terms of what is valued in your home, in the community, and more at large. And so that comes down to, is that solely by what college you attend, or partly by what college you attend? how is a good college communicated to students? I think that's a really important piece. And so, I think I found this pretty interesting. So for those of you who can't quite see that, 2/3 of Silicon Valley CEOs attended a state university. The other piece, emotional intelligence. And so this is this kind of, started out as somewhat of a fuzzy, term, but there's been more and more research behind it that's really looking at our interpersonal skills, how we interact in the workplace and at home. And what they're finding is that actually emotional intelligence or interpersonal and communication skills would account for more of our financial success than hard technical skills. And that might be, more dependent on specific jobs, more so than others, but I thought that was an interesting piece. So emotional intelligence, of course, just spending time, being available to talk, and especially for the young adults, sometimes that's just, finding those times when you naturally might just be in the same room at the same time, and so not necessarily forcing a conversation, but being available and being willing to drop what you're doing if, someone does want to talk. I think sometimes those opportunities might be few and far between, so they're really important and might be worth a sacrifice. So I think there's a really cool website that I put on here by Paul Ekman, who's a psychologist, researcher, who's done a lot of work on human emotions and reading facial cues and all this stuff. And so he created this map with the Dalai Lama, a map of emotional states. And so it's just a really interesting thing that students might be interested in taking a look at, but just to really help with simply identifying what they're feeling in any given moment and being able to put a label to it. That alone has been found, in some pretty interesting research studies using fMRI technology to dampen down the emotional responses in certain centers of the brain that would usually fire up when people are really anxious or sad or depressed. So I think that's a pretty interesting one. Really, this idea of just talking aloud about what's on other people's minds or what may be on other people's minds. There's this whole research study around the theory of mind, our ability to not mind read, but kind of guess what's in someone else's mind. And that's kind of at the heart of our ability to be empathic and our ability to really kind of share emotional states and our ability to be effective, in communicating with other people. So I also wanted to put out there fostering a cooperative or cooperation mindset. So Lives in the Balance is a nonprofit started by a psychologist named Ross Green, who does a lot of work with collaborative problem solving, which is kind of an approach to both in families, in schools, in juvenile detention centers, in prisons, to really work with young adults and children that tend to have more of that kind of defiant or oppositional type of behavior that might be also coming alongside depression or other mental health challenges. So it's a really great website. It's got tons of information just in terms of how to really have a collaborative conversation with a young adult around what's important to them and really trying to come up with ways to solve those day-to-day problems that you could predict might show up again and again. And so, all right, policy recommendations. I think this is just a collection of things from different areas, but I think it's worth consideration. And some of this is a logistical nightmare, and so it's just a matter of how do you even begin to approach this. And to be honest, I don't really know a lot of what St. Mary's current policies and practices are. So just I want to say this isn't tailored specifically to you and to this school, but it's I think it's some general things that some other schools have found useful. All right. So the last one. I don't know, maybe you guys could mention to me what kind of programming, if at all, do you have around stress management, that kind of thing?
Well, our new schedule next year, 2.0, will actually hopefully address a lot of those issues. School won't start in high school until
all but the first and the last one.
Yeah, we'll have frequent breaks, so kids will have 26 class days in between each mod, which is sort of akin to a term, and they'll have 4 or 5 day breaks on all of those. Our PE classes are getting overhauled to be much more sort of health-centered and lifestyle skills, including using all the great resources around the area address a lot of those things in our program is because we don't have a ton of those things right at this very moment, which I think is
Yeah, that's fair to say.
So, one thought I have, and just kind of off the top, is that some of these more kind of skill-based stress reduction, stress management strategies that that aren't so easy to learn without some sort of kind of focused, repetitive training. Kind of a difficult thing to do, in a one-on-one format. Sometimes they're difficult to do online. And so I think like in the school setting, that can be a great opportunity. I'm also looking to try to find ways to, I might be able to offer, time or workshops, whether kind of as a part of my role at Southern Oregon Peds, and as in maybe an outreach, with the community in terms of offering some stress reduction type of programming. And so that's something that we can, if you're interested, we can certainly talk about, because I think there's some really cool stuff out there that can be really geared toward young adults and helping them have kind of that foundation of, really how to regulate, their own mind and body in a way that works for them. So when to seek professional help? So clearly there's a point at which, stress becomes, intense enough, and it maybe has been around for long enough when it makes sense to really talk to somebody, to talk to a professional about what's happening. And so, sorry again, it's a really small type, but this is just a list of a lot of different, kind of warning signs that the stress level has reached, is kind of in the red, and a child or adolescent is really, struggling to find ways to manage that stress in healthier, ways. So this one is more specific to depression, so these are a lot of the signs, and oftentimes it's not every single one, but it's a cluster of a few of those that really start to stand out and would suggest that, there's at least, some impact of stress on that child or adolescent's life that would warrant, some sort of change, whether that's, some sort of active treatment or, some way of addressing whatever the stressful things going on. Bullying is clearly one of those that happen from time to time, that really, when that's addressed, oftentimes the depression is more of a reaction to bullying. And so, so I think that's just as an aside. So resources, I would suggest talking with your pediatricians. I would suggest if you, depending on what type of insurance you have, I've put in a list of local providers who accept private insurance, and so that link has, for children of various ages, for adolescents, for adults, it's a fairly comprehensive guide of the people in the community that are providing some sort of psychological service for different concerns. So lastly, crisis resources. So I have to mention this just because along with depression sometimes comes suicidal ideation, and unfortunately in the state of Oregon comes, a higher incidence of suicide than a lot of states in the country. And so I think that having these numbers available not only to parents but also to adolescents is really important. And so Jackson County has a crisis line. They have crisis services 24/7. Depending on availability, sometimes they have a mobile crisis response team that can come to wherever the person in crisis happens to be. And so that can be a very useful line. There's a national crisis line as well, 24/7, just to be able to link up and to talk with somebody and get some support. There's also a national crisis text line, and so that's one that is a little bit maybe more available or likely to be used, by some folks. And so I think that's a really nice service too. So on that happy note, I'm going to stop there. I know that can be really heavy, and at the same time, it's not like an outcome that is likely to happen if someone's experiencing chronic stress, but for just a very small percentage of some children and adolescents, it's a real possibility. And so, we need to make sure that we have that safety net in place. So I'm going to stop talking and just see if anybody has any questions on any of this stuff or any comments at all.